In our minimalist economic appartement, we don't have much heat, so I have to wear a lot of clothes. In our economic, we were continuing in the economy first chapter of Walden. Thoreau had said in context, he said, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. And it may be that he who bestows the largest amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his mode of life to produce that misery which he strives in vain to relieve. It is the pious slave breeder devoting the proceeds of every 10th slave to buy a Sunday's liberty for the rest. So if you steal from the poor, then only to donate to the poor. It is the pious slave breeder devoting the proceeds of every 10th slave to buy a Sunday's liberty for the rest. Some show their kindness to the poor by employing them in their kitchens. Would they not be kinder if they employed themselves there? You can give people a job in the kitchen as employees. Right, employees of a corporation under Chomsky are slaves. You boast of spending a 10th part of your income in charity. Maybe here you're boasting of it. Maybe you should spend the 9/10 so and have done with it. Society recovers only a 10th part of the property then. Is this owing to the generosity of him in whose possession it is found, or to the remissness of the officers of justice? Philanthropy is almost the only virtue which is sufficiently appreciated by mankind. What? What? The whole section? Do you think that those billionaires, if they had higher taxes rates, see, they could just have a low tax rate, accumulate a huge amount of money, then have to donate it, or just not accumulate so much by monopoly power? What was the way you like monopolies so you can make a lot of money? That's the only way I like. I can't have a business unless it's an absolute total monopoly. You know how we like the gas station? There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root, and it may be that he who bestows the largest amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his mode of life to produce that misery which he strives in vain to relieve. It is the pious slave breeder devoting the proceeds of every 10th slave to buy a Sunday's liberty for the rest. Well, that way they can take off Sunday for church. The slaves can go to church. Some show their kindness to the poor by employing them in their kitchens. Would they not be kinder if they employed them themselves there? You boast of spending a 10th part of your income in charity. Maybe you should spend the 9/10 so and have done with it. Society recovers only a 10th part of the property then. Is this owing to the generosity of him in whose possession it is found, or to the remissness of the officers of justice? Philanthropy is almost the only virtue which is sufficiently appreciated by mankind. Nay, it is greatly overrated, and it is our selfishness which overrates it. Do we overrate it? Philanthropy? A robust poor man One sunny day here in Concord praised a fellow townsman to me, because, as he said, he was kind to the poor, meaning himself. The kind uncles and aunts of the race are more esteemed than its true spiritual fathers and mothers. There's not many people treating the souls of men. They only give them material things. So that's the people that's striking at the root. If they're philanthropists, they don't strike at the root of the problem. If you're Buddha, may be struck at the root, but others don't strike so much. The kind uncles and races are more esteemed than its true spiritual fathers and mothers. I have once heard a reverend lecturer on England, a man of learning and intelligence, having enumerating her scientific, literary, and political worthies, Shakespeare, Bacon, Cromwell, Newton, Wilton, Milton, Newton, and others, speak next to her Christian heroes, whom, as if his profession required it of him, he elevated to a place far above all the rest as the greatest of the great. These are the greatest now, ready? They were Penn, Howard, and Mrs. Fry. Everyone must feel the falsehood and cant of this. The last were not England's best men and women, only perhaps her best philanthropists. You think the philanthropists are the best? Why is he jealous of the philanthropist? I would not subtract anything from the praise that is due to philanthropy, but merely demand justice for all who, by their lives and works, are a blessing to mankind. Do you think my work is far superior to Bill Gates? No. I do not value chiefly a man's uprightness and benevolence, which are, as it were, his stem and leaves, those plants of whose greenness withered we make herb tea. For the sick serve but a humble use, and we are most employed by quacks. I want the flower and fruit of a man. That same fragrance he wafted over from him to me, and some ripeness flavor our intercourse. His goodness must not be a partial or transitory act, but a constant superfluity, which costs him nothing, and of which he is unconscious. Do you think if a man gives you attention, that's superior? Just attention. This is a charity that hides a multitude of sins. The philanthropist too often surrounds mankind with the remembrance of his own cast-off griefs as an atmosphere, and calls it sympathy. We should impart our courage and not our despair, our health and ease and not our disease, and take care that this does not spread by contagion. For what southern plains comes up the voice of wailing? Under what latitudes reside the heathen to whom we would send light? Who is it that intemperate and brutal man whom we would redeem, if anything ail a man, so that he does not perform his functions, if he have a pain in his bowels even, for that is the seat of sympathy, he forthwith sets about reforming the world. Being a microcosm himself, he discovers, and it is a true discovery, and he is the man to make it, that the world has been eating green apples. To his eyes, in fact, the globe itself is a great green apple, which there is danger awful to think of, that the children of men will nibble before it is ripe. And straightway his drastic philanthropy seeks out the Esquimaux and the Patagonian, and embraces the populous Indian and Chinese villages, and thus by a few years of philanthropic activity, the powers, in the meanwhile, using him for their own ends, no doubt he cures himself of his dyspepsia. The globe acquires a faint blush on one or both of its cheeks, and if it were beginning to be ripe, and life loses its crudity and is once more sweet and wholesome to live. Do you understand that? You do. That's good. My unconscious might understand it, but I don't understand it. No, it's too convoluted. He doesn't know how to write. The sentences are too long. I never dreamed of any enormity greater. Read, read it again. I just said the sentence was too long. Nah. By a few years of philanthropic activity, the powers, in the meanwhile, using him for his own ends, no doubt, he cures himself of his dyspepsia, and the globe acquires a faint blush on one or both of its cheeks, as if it was beginning to be ripe, and life loses its crudity, and is once more sweet and wholesome to live. I never dreamed of any enormity greater than I have committed. I never knew, and never shall know, a worse man than myself. I believe that what so saddens the reformer is not his sympathy with his fellows in distress, but though he be the holiest Son of God, is his private ail. Let this be righted. Let the spring come to him, the morning rise over his couch, and he will forsake his enormous companions without apology. My excuse for not lecturing against the use of tobacco is that I never chewed it. That is a penalty which reformed tobacco chewers have to pay, though there are things enough I have chewed which I could lecture against. If you should ever be betrayed into any of these philanthropies, do not let your left hand know what your right hand does, for it is not worth knowing. You could be involved in a number of causes, but they're not the root of evil, right? Let's say you try to stamp out cigarette smoking. Is that the root of evil? Let's say alcoholism, opiates. How do you strike out the root of evil? That's what we're trying to figure out. Rescue the drowning and tie your shoestrings. Take your time and set about some free labor. Our manners have been corrupted by communication with the saints. How did that happen? Our hymn books resound with a melodious cursing of God and enduring him forever. One would say that even the prophets and redeemers had rather consoled the fears than confirmed the hopes of man. There is nowhere recorded a simple and irrepressible satisfaction with the gift of life, any memorable praise of God. All health and success does me good, however far off and withdrawn it may appear. All disease and failure helps to make me sad, and does me evil, however much sympathy it may have with me, or I with it. That if then we will indeed restore mankind by truly Indian, botanic, magnetic, and natural means, let us first be as simple as well as nature ourselves. There's in one of the books, it's in Neoplatonism or something, Proclus or Plotinus. So it's just walking. It's like walking is like similar to a spiritual journey. The inner spiritual path is similar to just walking. As simple and well as nature ourselves, dispel the clouds which hang over our own brows, and take up a little life into our pores. Do not stay to be an overseer of the poor, but endeavor to become one of the worthies of the world. You should become more worthwhile yourself before you help the poor. Maybe 10,000 hours of meditation. I read in the Gulistan, or flower garden, or Sheikh Sadi of Saraz, that they ask a wise man, saying, of the many celebrated trees, which the Most High God has created lofty and umbrageous, they call none azad, or free, excepting the cypress, which bears no fruit. What mystery is there in this? He replied. Each has its appropriate produce and appointed season, during the continuance of which it is fresh and blooming, and during their absence dry and withered, to neither of which states is the cypress exposed, being always flourishing, and of this nature are the azads, or the religious independents. Fix not thy heart on that which is transitory, for the Dijlal or Tigris will continue to flow through Baghdad after the race of caliphs is extinct. If thy hand has plenty, be liberal as the date tree. But if it affords nothing to give away, be an exod or free man like the cypress. This is complemental verses. This must be like a poem. Well, this is not his poem. It's T-K-C-A-R-E-W. Thou dost presume too much, poor needy wretch. This is the pretensions of poverty. Thou dost presume too much, poor needy wretch, to claim a station in the firmament, because thy humble cottage or thy tub nurses some lazy or pedantic virtue, in the cheap sunshine or by shady springs, with roots and pot herbs, where thy right hand, tearing those human passions from the mind, upon whose stalks fair blooming virtues flourish, degradeth nature and benumbeth sense, and Gorgon-like turns active men to stone, we not require the dull society of your necessitated temperance, or that unnatural stupidity, that knows nor joy nor sorrow, nor thy forced falsely exalted passive fortitude, above the active, less low abject brood, that fix their seats in mediocrity, become your servile minds. But we advance such virtues only as admit excess, brave and bounteous acts, regal magnificence, all-seeing prudence, magnanimity, that knows no bound, and that heroic virtue for which antiquity hath left no name, but patterns only, such as Hercules, Theseus, back to thy loathed self. And when thou seest the new enlightened sphere, study to know but what thou's worthies were. Where I lived and what I lived for. This is like a new section. Where I lived and what I lived. What he lived for. Where he lived. And what he lived for. What do we live for? Where do we live? We're going to read about what I read, what to read. He has a section on reading. And then sounds. Where I lived and what I lived for, at a certain season of our life, we are accustomed to consider every spot as the possible site of a house. I have thus surveyed the country on every side within a dozen miles of where I live. In imagination I have brought all the farms in succession, in imagination I have bought all the farms in succession, for all were to be bought, and I knew their price. I walked over each farmer's premises, tasted his wild apples, discoursed on husbandry with him, took his farm at his price, at any price, mortgaging it to him in my mind. Even put a higher price on it, took everything but a deed of it, took his word for his deed, for I dearly love to talk. He's a talker. Do you think he walked around and talked to people? Cultivated it, and him too, to some extent, I trust, and withdrew when I had enjoyed it long enough, leaving him to carry it on. This experience entitled me to be regarded as a sort of real estate broker by my friends. He's a real estate broker. He's also does surveying, so I could see that. Whenever I sat, there I might live. Wherever I sat, there I might live, and the landscape radiated from me accordingly. Did the landscape radiate from him, or did it radiate into him? Which comes first, perception or the perceiver? You hear me? Dear. Did the landscape radiate from him, or did it radiate into him? Wherever I sat, there I might live, and the landscape radiated from me accordingly. What is a house but a seatus, a seat? Better if a country seat. I discovered many a site for a house not likely to be soon improved, which some might have thought too far from the village, but to my eyes the village was too far from it. Where there I might live, I said, there I did live. For an hour, a summer and a winter life, saw how I could let the years run off, buffet this winter through, and see the spring come in. The future inhabitants of this region, wherever they may place their homes, may be sure that they have been anticipated. An afternoon sufficed to lay out the land into orchard, woodlot, and pasture, and to decide what fine oaks or pines should be left to stand before the door, and whence each blasted tree could be seen to the best advantage, and then I let it lie. Well, perchance, for a man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. A man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. Do you think we should just let things alone and make ourselves rich by leaving him alone? Interesting. It's one way of doing it. So I just read to my leisure. This is a very selfish approach to reading. I just read when I feel like it. My imagination carried me so far that I even had the refusal of several farms. The refusal was all I wanted, but I never got my fingers burned by actual possession. The nearest that I came to actual possession was when I bought the Hollowell place, and I had begun to sort my seeds and collected materials with which to make a wheelbarrow to carry it on or off with, but before the owner gave me a deed of it, his wife, every man has such a wife, changed her mind and wished to keep it. He offered me $10 to release him. Recall, Thoreau bought a farm. He bought a farm, and his wife didn't want to sell it, so the transaction folded. And we got. Now, to speak the truth, I had but 10 cents in the world, and it surpassed my arithmetic to tell if I was that man who had 10 cents, or who had a farm, or $10, or all together. However, I let him keep the $10 and the farm too, for I had carried it far enough. Or rather, to be generous, I sold him the farm for just what I gave for it, and as he was not a rich man, made him a present of $10, and still had my 10 cents, and seeds, and materials for a wheelbarrow left. I found thus that I had been a rich man without any damage to my poverty. But I retained the landscape, and I have since annually carried off what it yielded without a wheelbarrow. With respect to landscapes, quote, I am monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. I have frequently seen a poet withdraw, having enjoyed the most valuable part of a farm, while the crusty farmer supposed that he had got a few wild apples only. Why, the owner does not know it. For many years, when a poet has put his farm in rhyme, the most admirable kind of invisible fence has fairly impounded it, milked it, skimmed it, and got all the cream, and left the farmer only the skimmed milk. The real attractions of the Hollowell farm to me were its complete retirement, being about 2 miles from the village, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, and separated from the highway by a broad field, its bounding on the river, which the owner said protected it by its fogs from frost in the spring. Though that was nothing to me, the gray color and ruinous state of the house and barn, and the dilapidated fences, which put such an interval between me and the last occupant, the hollow, lichen-covered apple trees gnawed by rabbits, showing what kind of neighbors I should have. But above all, the recollection I had of it from my earliest voyages up the river, when the house was concealed behind a dense grove of red maples. I wonder what farm he wanted to buy. Where that was, though, which I heard the house dog bark. I was an ace to buy it before the proprietor finished getting out some rocks, cutting down the hollow apple trees, and grubbing up some young birches which had sprung up in the pasture, or, in short, had made any more of his improvements. To enjoy these advantages, I was ready to carry it on, like Atlas, to take the world on my shoulders. I never heard what compensation he received for that, and do all those things which had no other motive or excuse but that I might pay for it and be unmolested in my possession of it. But I knew all the while that it would yield the most abundant crop of the kind I wanted, if I could only afford to let it alone. I wish you can afford to leave the woods alone. Afford not to develop. If you get very rich, you can afford not to develop. But it turned out as I have said. All that I could say then was, with respect to farming on a large scale, I have always cultivated a garden was that I had my seeds ready. Many think that seeds improve with age. I have no doubt that time discriminates between the good and the bad, and when at last I shall plant, I shall be less likely to be disappointed. But I would say to my fellows, once for all, as long as possible, live free and uncommitted. Live free and uncommitted. As long as possible, live free and uncommitted. So like no attachments. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or the county jail. Old Cato, whose De Re Rustica is my cultivator, says that the only translation I have seen makes sheer nonsense of the passage. Quote, when you think of getting a farm, turn it thus in your mind, not to buy greedily, nor spare your pains to look at it, and do not think it enough to go round it once. The oftener you go there, the more it will please you, if it is good. I think I shall not buy greedily, but go round and round it as long as I live, and be buried in it first, that it may please me the more at last. The present was my next experiment of this kind, which I propose to describe more at length for the convenience, putting the experience of 2 years into one. As I have said, I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. The present, now he's talking about going to his Walden experiment. The present with my next experiment of this kind, which I propose to describe more at length for convenience, putting the experience of 2 years into one. As I have said, I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. You wake up yet? When first I took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day, or the 4th of July, 1845. My house was not furnished for winter, but was merely a defense against the rain, without plastering or chimney, the walls being of rough, weather-stained boards with wide chinks. Chink is like a little crack, I guess, which make it cool at night. The upright white-hewn studs and freshly paned window and doors and window casings gave it a clean and airy look, especially in the morning when its timbers were saturated with dew, so that I fancied that by noon some sweet gum would exude from them to my imagination. It retained throughout the day more or less of this aureole character, reminding me of a certain house on a mountain which I had visited a year before. This was an airy, unplastered cabin. It's like unplastered log cabin. It's not a log cabin, it's a plank cabin. Fit to entertain a traveling god, where a goddess might trail her garments. The winds which passed over my dwelling were such as swept over the ridges of mountains, bearing broken strains or celestial parts of terrestrial music. The morning wind forever blows. The poem of creation is uninterrupted, but few are the ears that hear it. Olympus is but the outside of the earth everywhere. The only house I had been the owner of before, if I except a boat, was a tent, which I used occasionally when making excursions in the summer, and this is still rolled up in my garret. But the boat, after passing from hand to hand, has gone down the stream of time. With this more substantial shelter about me, I had made some progress towards settling in the world. This frame, so slightly clad, was a sort of crystallization around me and reacted on the builder. It was suggestive somewhat as a picture in outlines. I did not need to go outdoors to take the air, for the atmosphere within had lost none of its freshness. It was not so much within doors as behind a door where I sat, even in the rainiest weather. A Harry Vansa says, "An abode without birds is like a meat without seasoning." Such was not my abode, for I found myself suddenly neighbor to the birds, not by having imprisoned them, but having caged myself near them. I was not only near to some of those which commonly frequent the garden or the orchard, but those wilder and more thrilling songsters of the forest, which never or rarely serenade a villager, the wood rush, the veery, the scarlet tanager, the field sparrow, the whippoorwill, and many others. It's cold here. Your feet cold. Mm. Mm. Turn it on when I get done here. Yeah, but we're coming to the reading section where in Walden we're going to read. What's he read, anyways? What does he read in the woods? Can you read in the woods? I don't see why not. I was seated by the shore of a small pond about a mile and a half south of the village of Concord and somewhat higher than it, in the midst of an extensive wood between the town and Lincoln, and about 2 miles south of that our only field known to fame, Concord battlefield, to about 2 miles south of Concord battleground. But I was so low in the woods that the opposite shore, half a mile off, like the rest, covered with wood, was my most distant horizon. For the first week, let us see. For the first week, whenever I looked out on the pond, it impressed me like a tarn worn up on the side of a mountain, its bottom far above the surface of other lakes. And as the sun arose, I saw it throwing off its nightly clothing of mist, and here and there, by degrees, its soft ripples of its smooth, reflecting surface was revealed, while the mist, like ghosts, were steadily withdrawing in every direction into the woods, as at the breaking up of some nocturnal conventicle. The very dew seemed to hang upon the trees later into the day than usual, as on the sides of mountains. This small lake was of most value. What? This small lake was of most value as a neighbor in the intervals of a gentle rainstorm in August, when, both air and water being perfectly still, but the sky overcast, noon after noon had all the serenity of evening, and the wood thrush sang around and was heard from shore to shore. A lake like this is never smoother than at such a time, and the clear portion of the air above it being shallow and darkened by clouds, the water full of light and reflections becomes a lower heaven itself, so much the more important. Dear, I think you could go to like the Adirondacks and find some unspoiled lakes with a cabin. Do you think we should go to the Adirondacks? It's a park, so it's protected from a lot of development. It's a large park. I think we should go to the Adirondacks. From a hilltop nearby, where the wood had been recently cut off, there was a pleasing vista southward across the pond, through a wide indentation in the hills which form the shore there, where their opposite sides sloping towards each other suggested a stream flowing out in that direction through a wooded valley, but stream there was none. That way I looked between and over the near green hills to some distant and higher ones in the horizon, tinged with blue. Indeed, by standing on tiptoe, I could catch a glimpse of some of the peaks of the still bluer and more distant mountain ranges in the northwest. Those true blue coins from heaven's own mint, and also some portion of the village. But in other directions, even from this point, I could not see over or beyond the woods which surrounded me. I was well to have some water in your. It is well to have some water in your neighborhood to give buoyancy to unfold the earth. One value even of the smallest well is that when you look into it, you see that earth is not continent but insular. This is as important as that it keeps butter cool. When I looked across the pond from this peak towards the Sudbury meadows, which in time of flood I distinguished, elevated perhaps by a mirage in their seething valley, like a coin in a basin, all the earth beyond the pond appeared like a thick, thin crust, insulated and floated. Even by this small sheet of intervening water, I was reminded that this, on which I dwelt, was but dry land. Though the view from my door was still more contracted, I did not feel crowded or confined in the least. There was pasture enough for my imagination. The low shrub oak plateau to which the opposite shore arose stretched away towards the prairies of the west and the steppes of Tartary, affording ample room for all the roving families of men. Quote, there are none happy in the world but beings who enjoy freely a vast horizon, says Damodara, when his herds required new and larger pastures. Both place and time were changed, and I dwelt nearer to those parts of the universe, to those eras in history which had most attracted me. Where I lived was as far off as many a region viewed nightly by astronomers. We are wont to imagine rare and delectable places in some remote and more celestial corner of the system, behind the constellation of Cassiopeia's chair, far from noise and disturbance. I discovered that my house actually had its site in such a withdrawn but forever new and unprofaned part of the universe. If it were worth the while to settle in those parts near to the Pleiades or the Hyades or to Aldebaran or Altar, then I was ready there, or at an equal remoteness from the life which I had left behind, dwindled and twinkling with as fine a ray to my nearest neighbor, and to be seen only in moonless nights by him. Such was that part of creation where I had squatted. Quote, there was a shepherd that did live, and held his thoughts as high as were the mounts whereon his flocks did hourly feed him by. What should we think of the shepherd's life if his flocks always wandered to higher pastures than his thoughts? Every morning was a cheerful invitation to make my life equal simplicity, I may say innocence, with nature herself. I have been as sincere a worshipper of Aurora as the Greeks. I got up early and bathed in the pond. That was a religious exercise, and one of the best things which I did. They say that characters were engraven on the bathing tub of King Ching's Thang to this effect: renew thyself completely every day. Do it again and again and forever again. I can understand that. Morning brings back the heroic ages. I was as much affected by the faint hum of a mosquito making its invisible and unimaginable tour through my apartment at earliest dawn, when I was sitting with door and window open, as I could be by any trumpet that ever sang of fame. It was Homer's Requiem itself, an Iliad and Odyssey in the air, singing its own wrath and wanderings. There was something cosmical about it, a standing advertisement, till forbidden, and of the everlasting vigor and fertility of the world. The morning, which is the most memorable season of the day, is the awakening hour. You think we should awaken in the morning, or be awakening hour? The morning, which is the most memorable season of the day, is the awakening hour. Then there is least somnolence in us, and for an hour at least some part of us awakens, which slumbers all the rest of the day and night. Little is to be expected of that day, if it can be called a day, to which we are not awakened by our genius, but by the mechanical nudgings of some servitor, are not awakened by our own newly acquired force and aspirations from within, accompanied by the undulations of celestial music, instead of factory bells and a fragrance filling the air, to a higher life than we fell asleep from, and thus the darkness bear its fruit and prove itself to be good, no less than the light. I think you should meditate on that. The morning, which is the most memorable season of the day, is the awakening hour. Then there is least somnolence in us, and for an hour at least some part of us awakens, which slumbers for all the rest of the day and night. Little is to be expected of that day, if it cannot be called a day to which we are not awakened by our genius, but by the mechanical nudgings of some servitor, are not awakened by our own newly acquired force and aspirations from within, accompanied by the undulations of the music of the spheres, of the undulations of the celestial music, instead of factory bells and a fragrance filling the air, to a higher life than we fell asleep from, and thus the darkness bear its fruit and prove itself to be good, no less than the light. That man who does not believe that each day contains an earlier, more sacred, aerial hour than he has yet profaned has despaired of life, and is pursuing a descending and darkening way after a partial cessation of his sensuous life. The soul of man, or its organs rather, are reinvigorated each day, and his genius tries again what noble life it can make. All memorable events, I shall say, transpire in morning time and in a morning atmosphere. The Vedas say, all intelligences awake with the morning. Poetry and art, and the first and the most memorable of the actions of men, date from such an hour. All poets and heroes, like Memnon, are the children of Aurora and emit their music at sunrise. To him whose elastic and vigorous thought keeps pace with the sun, the day is perpetual morning. And it matters not what the clocks say, or the attitudes or labors of men. Morning is when I am awake and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effect to throw off sleep. Why is it that men give so poor an account of their day if they have not been slumbering? They are not such poor calculators. If they had not been overcome with drowsiness, they would have performed something. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 millions to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I have never yet met a man who was quite alive. How could I have looked him in the face? So there's only 2 in a million who is practicing not yoga. 2 in a million. But there's a few intellectuals waking up. There's only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion, but only 1 in 100 millions to poetic or divine life. 1 in 100 million. We're looking at the calculus of spirituality. He's suggesting you can listen to the music of the spheres in the morning if you're in the 1 in 100 million. We are read from Where I Lived and What I Lived For. Is that what you live for, to get up in the morning and do meditation? We read from we started out striking at the root of evil and somehow ended up in meditation. Isn't that interesting? How we end up in meditation. His goal was to only to wake my neighbors up. His purpose was to be a chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roofs, if only to wake my neighbors up. So he wrote the Walden and lived there just to wake us up. We're reading from the Holy Bible of American religion, or Transcendentalism. And now I'm starting to wake up. I need a cup of coffee, dear. Will you make some? So we can wake up and try to understand what he said. Why, hopefully I do understand it. But I should wake up and sit in surat, shabd yoga, listening to the music of the spheres, and then read Walden, I guess. What do you think? Well, interesting, you could trace back his concept of the celestial music back to the golden chain, all the way back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras, this goes back to Neoplatonism, back through Egypt and Hermes and Plato, and Plotinus, Plotinus, and Proclus. So he's just talking about the books, this book. Well, we could go through Taylor, I suppose. I'll just take Thomas Taylor. To figure out how Platonism, Plato, influenced the rise of American Transcendentalism through Bronson Alcott and Emerson, and how Bronson Alcott took a lot of walks with Thoreau. Went on a walk. We were reading about what Thoreau does in the morning. How to get up in the morning is about what it's about.